Everyone. Thank you again for tuning in to AP Macroeconomics live lessons. I'm Jen Rayfields, and I'm looking forward to being with you tonight. Before we get into our lesson, though, I am thrilled to let you know about something exciting for tomorrow. So Janet Yellen, who, as I'm sure you know, is an eminent economist and former chairperson of the Federal Reserve, is going to be joining us for our lesson tomorrow. We're calling it Masterclass with Janet Yellen. Mr. Romano and I are going to get a chance to ask her some questions about monetary and fiscal policy and the current state of the economy. And we are both so honored and privileged and excited to do so tomorrow night. So if you get a chance, please go ahead and tune in. We'll be live streaming at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard. But as with all these lessons, it will be available after the fact in case that time doesn't work for you. But I absolutely encourage you to let your friends know, let your teachers know, so that you can have a chance to be a part of this amazing opportunity. And I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow night. All right, so let's get into our lesson. All right, so yesterday, Mr. Romano took you through like the basics of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, what it represents, how it's used as a tool to describe, predict, and explain changes in macroeconomic conditions and outcomes. So tonight we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of it a little bit. You may have noticed that we left out multipliers yesterday. I thought it might be nice, since the multiplier concept ties in with fiscal policy, that we would do both those things together. So we're actually not going to go quite in order. We'll start with fiscal policy, and we'll spend the bulk of our time together just reviewing what you probably already are really familiar with when it comes to fiscal policy. And then we're going to get into talking about automatic stabilizers. Sometimes this concept proves a little tricky for kids. And then we're going to finish up with the multiplier conceptually, definitionally, how to use it, and how to calculate changes in economic conditions based on your understanding of the multiplier. So that's our plan for this evening. So we will go ahead and get right in. All right, so we're going to start with fiscal policy. And the first learning objective in the course and exam description for this topic is to be able to define fiscal policy in related terms. So we'll do that fairly quickly. I'm sure these terms and definitions are familiar to you. But as is always the case, the more precise your understanding of the term, the more application ability you have when it comes to applying it conceptually. So it's worth a review of the language that goes along with each of these terms. So fiscal policy, as you know, are legislative actions by the government that change government revenue or expenditures, which can influence aggregate demand and then consequently real output and the price level, right? And when real output changes, we know the unemployment rate, the cyclical unemployment rate changes as well. Now, the tools of fiscal policy you've been talking about all semester include government spending, which is government payments in exchange for goods and services. So the government is going to purchase goods and services, and we call that government spending. They could be purchasing an aircraft carrier, they could be purchasing staples for the IRS. You know, when the government purchases goods and services, we consider that government spending. Taxes, as you know, are payments to the government from citizens. They're mandatory, they're required by law. Most people pay income tax, federal income tax. So those are they're a sort of a form of transfer, right? Because no goods or services are being exchanged. It's a transfer of money from an individual or a firm to the government. There's no exchange of goods and services. And then with transfers, conceptually, it's very similar. Instead of payments to the government, which is what taxes are, it's payments from the government. And again, there's no exchange. And understanding that is really the insight to help you understand why the spending multiplier is greater than the tax or transfer multiplier. So if conceptually you understand that the government is purchasing goods and services, which is counted as part of aggregate demand, that's going to have a bigger effect on overall economic activity than a change in taxes or transfers, in which there is no initial change in GDP that results from those transfers. All right, so now discretionary policy refers to the changes in spending, taxes, and transfers that are triggered by a legislative action of the government that the government is undertaking in response to economic conditions. And if you're listening to the news at all, you know that right now, Congress, if they haven't already decided today, last week and going into the weekend, they were deciding on a major addition to the fiscal stimulus that has already been undertaken by the government in response to the economic crisis that's emerging in the wake of the pandemic. So the discretionary fiscal policy requires a new law. The government, they're monitoring the health of the economy, they're determining economic policy may be warranted, and then they're passing a new piece of legislation designed to change either tax receipts or government spending or transfers, and that requires a new law to be passed. Whereas non-discretionary policy, which is what we're talking about usually when we're talking about automatic stabilizers, result from, they kick in automatically. They're triggered by changes in economic conditions that result from the business cycle itself. So they don't actually require a new law because they go into effect as a result of provisions in existing laws. So you want to know the difference between discretionary and non-discretionary fiscal policy. And then of course, these two terms should be very familiar for you by now. We have expansionary fiscal policy, which the government employs in order to stabilize a recessionary gap. And we have contractionary fiscal policy, which is the tool used by the government to stabilize an inflationary gap. And remember, we refer to these as stabilization policies very generally, and then counter-cyclical policies, right? Because the goal of expansionary policy is to counter a recession, and the goal of contractionary policy is to counter an inflationary gap. So those are the terms and definitions. Hopefully that was just a good short review. All right, so now let's sort of talk through in words how fiscal policy works. Okay, why does fiscal policy work? So I'm going to put the tools up on the slide so that we have them to refer to. And then we're going to bring back up our aggregate expenditure formula. So remember, when we're talking about aggregate demand, in this form, we're talking about aggregate spending by consumers, by firms, by the government, and by foreign buyers of US goods and services, or domestic goods and services. So aggregate demand is equal to the sum of consumption, investment spending, government spending, and the balance of exports minus imports. So when the government changes the amount of money it is spending on the purchase of goods and services, it has a direct effect on aggregate demand because government expenditures are part of aggregate demand. So if if government spending increases, then aggregate demand is going to increase because G is part of aggregate demand. And then the reverse is also true. If government spending decreases, all else equal, aggregate demand will fall because of the decrease in government spending on goods and services. So it's important to understand that taxes and transfers have an indirect impact on aggregate demand, and that's something you want to be able to explain. So it's an indirect effect because a change in taxes or a change in transfers affects the amount of disposable income of people. And when disposable income changes, that's a major determinant of consumer spending. So if you have, let's say, a tax cut, then that is designed to increase disposable income. And when disposable income increases, then C is going to go up, which causes aggregate demand to go up. So that indirect relationship is one that is really important to be able to explain. Okay, so the same is true with a tax cut. A tax increase. A tax increase results in a decrease in disposable income, which causes C to go down, which causes aggregate demand to go down. And transfers work in a very similar fashion. So transfers, when they increase, then disposable income increases, right? If you get an increase in unemployment benefits, or if you get an increase in rent subsidies, or if you get an increase in the amount of food support from the government, then you're going to effectively have more disposable income and consumption is going to increase. That causes aggregate demand to increase. And we know the reverse is true. If transfers decrease, if there is less transfer of money into the hands of households, then disposable income is going to fall, which causes consumption to fall, which causes aggregate demand to fall. So make sure you're clear on how to explain the short-run effects of fiscal policy by understanding how aggregate demand is calculated and understanding the implications of changes in taxes and spending on the aggregate demand formula, indirectly for taxes and transfers, directly for government spending. All right, now we also want to be able to do it graphically. So let's bring up a graph. of the economy. So we'll start with an economy that, in this case, can you tell what condition this economy is facing? You want to compare the potential output or full employment levels of output with the current output. And what you should see is that the current level of output in this model indicates that the economy is in a recessionary gap, right? The current output is less than the full employment or potential output, which means that the unemployment rate is greater than the natural unemployment rate. And we know when those conditions exist, the economy is in a recessionary gap. Expansionary policies are used to restore full employment when the economy is experiencing a recessionary gap. So the goal would be to use these policies to cause aggregate demand to increase and close the gap. So we'd want to, the policy objective is to increase aggregate demand. So how can we do that? Well, our expansionary policies would be to increase government spending, cut taxes, or increase transfer payments. Those are going to cause aggregate demand to increase. Once aggregate demand increases, we have short-run effects, which include an increase in output and an increase in the price level. So that's how we would explain the short-run effects of fiscal policy using a graph. Now let's see if we can do it with contractionary policy. So here we've got an inflationary gap, and we know it's an inflationary gap because full employment levels of output are below current levels of output. So when we compare those two, we see our inflationary gap. Current output is greater than potential output, which means the unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment. Those conditions create an inflationary gap. So that's when the government is going to employ contractionary policies, which are designed to decrease aggregate demand, right? We would want to see aggregate demand curve shift to the left in order to close the output gap in these cases. Well, our contractionary policy tools are to decrease government spending or increase taxes or decrease transfers. All of those would have the effect of decreasing aggregate demand, which then have the short run effects of reducing output and reducing the price level. So that's how we would be able to explain using graphs the short run effects of a fiscal policy. So again, you really want to be able to explain this both using words and your understanding of economics and using graphs in order to tell the story visually. Okay, so now another objective related to this is to be able to define why there are lags to discretionary fiscal policy. And for most of my career teaching AP Macroeconomics, I actually taught it in a course in which it was combined with AP US Government and Politics. And these connections were really simple to make in that course. So I couldn't help myself. I brought back up the Constitution. And this is what I always used to tell my students. Congress cannot raise or spend a dime without an act of law. So in order for the government to change the amount of money it's collecting in tax revenue, it requires a new piece of legislation. In order for the government to change the way it is spending money, it requires a new piece of legislation. And as I'm sure you're aware, if you're following the news at all, the lawmaking process is very complicated. Right? And it's compounded or confounded by a number of variables. But the first thing that contributes to a lag in terms of discretionary fiscal policy is that lawmakers first have to recognize that some kind of discretionary fiscal policy is warranted. So you know that the CPI and the unemployment rate and the GDP growth rate, those rates are reported in ways that describe sort of what has happened to the economy. So by the time, like, of course, the number of initial jobless claims comes out every week, but the monthly unemployment rate is published once a month. And so by the time Congress recognizes that an economic situation may warrant fiscal policy, some time has generally elapsed. And then, and this is the part that you're seeing playing out in the news right now, they have to agree on a course of action. Right. And so policymakers generally agree that full employment levels of output, price stability, steady increases in real GDP per capita over time. I've never met somebody who disagrees with those as policy goals, but there is just a tremendous amount of disagreement over how we go about achieving those. And some people think there's no role for the government in that process. So, as you know, there's a lot of there's an ideological divide between various members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so they have to agree, you need a simple majority in order to get something passed in the House. You need a simple majority in order to get it passed in the Senate. And then it needs to be agreed upon by the president in order to be signed into law. And if you can't get the president to agree, then you need super majorities in the House and in the Senate. And so getting some agreement on what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, that takes some time as well. And we're seeing that play out in the news literally as we speak. So then an implementation plan has to be both developed and executed. So once Congress passed the initial stimulus package to respond to the the shutdown of the U.S. economy triggered by the shelter-in-place orders, the Congress then had to figure out, how do we get this money that we're saying we're going to provide to small businesses in order to support their ability to keep people on the payroll? How are we going to get that money into their hands? Which banks are going to conduct it? How are banks going to conduct it? What are the regulations that are part of this package? So I don't want to belabor the process, but I think in terms of like the real world implications of fiscal policy, recognizing what you're seeing in the news right now as we speak, that's one of maybe sort of, you might say, it could be considered an advantage or a disadvantage when it comes to fiscal policy. This idea that there are lags in terms of when you recognize the policy is warranted, when you agree on what the policy is that you're going to implement, and then developing and executing an implementation plan. All of that takes some time. So that's why, discretionary policy might not be as timely as automatic fiscal policy or maybe monetary policy. Okay. All right. So now let's go to automatic stabilizers. So I guess it's important to understand that automatic stabilizers are triggered by the business cycle itself. And they go into effect as a result of changes in incomes and need that are a result of the business cycle. So I brought up our business cycle model so that we could kind of conceptualize what we're looking at here. So you'll remember that when we're looking at a simple business cycle model, in this case, it's real GDP over time. It could be real GDP growth rate over time. It could be real GDP per capita over time. But the idea is we want this nice, steady, stable increases in real GDP over time. But the reality is, because of a variety of reasons, not the least of which would be global health crises, we have these, booms and busts in the business cycle that result in periods of time when we are in an inflationary gap, and times when we are in excuse me, a recessionary gap. The GDP growth rate increases and then it decreases. Sometimes it's negative, et cetera. So that's our business cycle. So the idea is that these booms and busts cause a lot of economic hardships, right? Especially here when we are in when the economy is contracting and workers are losing their jobs. When you have high amounts of cyclical unemployment, it's not like if the unemployment rate is 10% that the economic pain of that is limited to those 10% of people. The entire economy suffers when you have less than full employment levels of output being produced. It means our future productive, our future consumption choices are going to be lower because we're not as producing as much today to have available in the future. We're doing less investment spending today, which is going to slow our economic growth rate. You have people out of work. You have people worried about the health of the economy, so they're spending less money. So even people who keep their jobs are going to be spending less, and the widespread effects of high unemployment are really bad, and they're bad for everybody's quality of life. And the same is true when you have periods of high inflation. If the unemployment rate falls below the natural rate, that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. It's not the most efficient use of those resources, but really it's the inflationary fears, the worry about this untethering of the actual inflation rate from the expected inflation rate. And it really makes it hard for people to make economic decisions when they aren't sure what's going to happen to prices. So for a variety of reasons, both, booms and busts have really negative consequences, economic and otherwise. So the goal of stabilization policy is to smooth out the business cycle. And with automatic stabilizers, they actually kick in as a result of the business cycle. They don't require a new act of law. So let's see how this works. So I'm going to start here with these periods in which we have increases in real GDP, right? When real GDP is rising, the economy is in this expansionary phase of the business cycle. And so what's happening there is real GDP is increasing, and in order to produce more output, unemployment is falling. So you have more workers working, more workers earning income, and national income rises. And once you're into that inflationary gap, then you're going to see that the people who are working are lobbying for higher wages as well. So as real GDP rises, the unemployment rate falls, and national income rises. As more people are working and or earning higher incomes, they qualify for less, or they stop qualifying altogether for unemployment and other social welfare benefits that are mandated by law. And so the result of this is that because more people are working and they're earning more money, transfer payments are going to decrease automatically. Rising incomes in the United States, which has a progressive income tax structure, as your nominal wage rises, as your income goes up, you could move into a higher tax bracket, and each additional dollar that you earn is subject to a higher tax rate than the previous dollars that you earned. And so that has a contractionary effect a contractionary effect as well. And so the progressive tax structure results in a de facto tax increase for people as their incomes rise. So the effect of a transfer payment decrease and a tax increase is contractionary. So automatic decreases in transfer payments and automatic increases in income tax rates are contractionary, and as the business cycle starts to heat up, as those automatic stabilizers kick in, the curve is going to flatten a little bit. All right, so let's work that through when the reverse is true. So when real GDP is falling, right, the economy is in the contractionary phase of the business cycle. And so what's happening? When real GDP falls, unemployment rises and national income falls. And so can you see where this is going? As fewer people are working and or earning lower, and those who are working are maybe working fewer hours, or they're seeing their wages fall, they qualify for more, or they begin to qualify for unemployment and other social welfare benefits that constitute transfer payments from the government. And so transfer payments are going to increase. So simultaneously, falling incomes for those workers who are earning less trigger lower marginal tax rates that result from a progressive income tax structure as well. And workers effectively experience a tax decrease. And these two are, of course, expansionary. So as the economy starts contracting, right, as real GDP is falling, as incomes are falling, and unemployment benefits are increasing, and marginal tax rates are falling, you get this sort of expansionary effect triggered by the automatic stabilizers. So that's sort of the mechanism and explanation for how automatic stabilizers work. All right. Okay, so now this is probably the part that you're waiting for. This tends to be one of the trickiest topics in AP Macro for my students. So we're going to spend a bit of time here really talking about multipliers. Okay, so bring back up our aggregate demand formula. Again, this is the aggregate expenditure approach to calculating real GDP based on expenditures on these 4 spending categories. And the multiplier basically means that a $1 change in autonomous expenditures leads to further changes in total expenditures and total output. So if we have $1 worth of spending, that is going to trigger additional changes in spending and output. And you've probably spent time in class talking about how that works. The simplest way to understand it is one person's spending is another person's income. So if I buy something for $1, right, now the person that I gave that dollar to in exchange for that transaction is part of GDP. It's part of aggregate demand. That person who got $1 from me is probably going to save some of that, but is probably going to spend some of that, him or herself. And so when they purchase goods or services with that dollar they receive from me, that is an additional increase in aggregate demand. So that's sort of how it works, right? But what it effectively means is that if you had a $20 increase in consumption, right? Well, that's going to eventually produce a much larger than $20 increase in aggregate demand. And how much of a change or how much greater the increase in aggregate demand is going to be is, as you know, a function of the multiplier. So the expenditure or spending multiplier is going to be useful to help quantify the size of the change in aggregate demand that results from a change in any of the components of aggregate demand. So that word autonomous, don't let it trip you up, right? Autonomous just means wasn't caused by any outside factor. So if I decide all of a sudden that I'm going to start spending more money than I was before, that's an autonomous change in consumption. If firms are investment spending at some rate and they decide for one reason or another to increase their rate of investment spending, then that's considered an autonomous change in expenditures. Okay. All right, so this is sort of a formula for all seasons when working with multiplier problems and looking at expenditures. The max change in aggregate demand is going to be equal to the initial change in expenditure times the spending multiplier. And you want to read that. Remember when you're looking at a graph, I wasn't planning on doing this, but I want to go back up to our aggregate demand graph for a minute, our ADAS model. When we're looking at this axis, right, real GDP, remember that Y is the symbol for income. And so as real GDP is changing when you learn to calculate GDP under the expenditure approach, you learned it was equal to GDP under the income approach. So as real GDP is changing, right, this little symbol Y here reminds you income is changing too. So when we have some quantity of aggregate output demanded, it correlates with some amount of real GDP, which correlates with some amount of national income, which correlates with some amount of actual output, right? So you can read aggregate demand, real GDP, output, income interchangeably within the context of thinking about this. And the model helps us visualize that, right? Real GDP is equal to aggregate output. It's equal to the quantity of aggregate output demanded at that price level. It's equal to national income. All right, so if you see any of those words in the problem, you know that you can use this multiplier formula. All right, so let's go back down to this. Okay, so the max change in aggregate demand, you could read that the max change in real GDP is equal to the initial change in expenditures times the spending multiplier. The max change in output is equal to the initial change in expenditures times the spending multiplier. So however the problem reads, you can still use this formula. All right, now the tax multiplier is what quantifies the size of the change in aggregate demand that results from a change in taxes or transfers. And so again, it's the same formula. We're just going to use the tax multiplier instead of the spending multiplier when we have to calculate the max change in aggregate demand that results from some kind of change in taxes or transfers. Okay, now what then are the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier, and how do we figure out what those are? And now we have to revisit what you learned way back in the beginning of Unit 3, which was the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. So remember, disposable income, right? There's that Y again to remind us that Y means income. Disposable income is basically equal to your gross income or the amount that you earn, the amount that you take in minus taxes, right? The disposable income is the amount that you have left after you meet your legal obligation to pay taxes on your earnings. And when you have a dollar in disposable income, you can do one of two things with it. You can spend it on consumption or spend it on consumer goods and services, or you can save it, right? There's only two things you can do with disposable income, spend or save. So the marginal propensity to consume tells us the percentage of each additional dollar that you earn of disposable income that you spend. And it's equal to the change in consumption over the change in disposable income. So MPC equals change in C over change in DI. The marginal propensity to save, on the other hand, is the percentage of the next dollar of disposable income earned that is saved, and it's computed as the change in savings over the change in disposable income. So what you should recognize here is if you have a dollar and you're going to spend 75 cents of it, the the amount of savings is going to equal 25 cents because it's $1. You're splitting it up into two parts. So the MPC plus the MPS always equals 1. And that might help you in thinking about these formulas or in thinking about how to derive one value or the other, depending on what you're given in the problem. Okay, now let's put this all together. So the spending multiplier is found by setting 1 over 1 minus MPC, or more simply, 1 over the marginal propensity to save, right? And then the tax multiplier is just a little bit different. It's equal to the marginal propensity to consume over the marginal propensity to save. And so what you see here is that both formulas can be derived from the MPC. So if you know the marginal propensity to consume, you can calculate the spending multiplier and you can calculate the tax multiplier. So let's do that with a couple of different MPCs so that you feel comfortable with this process. Okay, so assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. Can you calculate the spending multiplier using that information? Well, if it's 1 over 1 minus MPC, then you would do 1 over 1 minus 0.75, which is 1 over 0.25, which equals 4, right? 1 divided by 1/4 is equal to 4. Now, if we had that same MPC, we can calculate the tax multiplier too by setting the marginal propensity to consume over the marginal propensity to save. So 0.75 over 0.25 is equal to 3. 3/4 divided by 1/4 equals 3. All right, now let's use a different MPC. I'm going to give you a moment. I want you to calculate the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. Hopefully you arrived at 1 over 0.2 equals 5 on this side. And 0.8 over 0.2 equals 4 on this side. The last one we're going to look at is 0.9. If the marginal propensity to consume is 90%, then the spending multiplier is equal to 10, right? Because 1 over MPS is equal to 1 divided by 1/10, which is 10. And then over here, the tax multiplier would be 0.9 divided by 0.1, which equals 9. So now, for a given MPC, what do you notice about the relationship between the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier? Are there any relationships emerging? Because these rules are going to hold true and they may help you in your analysis. So what do you notice? For any MPC, the spending multiplier is 1 greater than the tax multiplier, right? So when the MPC is 0.75, spending multiplier is 4, tax multiplier is 3. Here it's 5, there it's 4. So the spending multiplier is greater than the tax multiplier, and the spending multiplier minus the tax multiplier for a given MPC is going to equal 1. All right, so if you have problems that ask you about the spending and the tax multiplier, that might give you a little bit of a shortcut in figuring out how to go about solving the problem. All right, so that is the spending and tax multiplier. So now we're going to do some practice together. So I'm going to switch to my document camera. Okay, I have a bunch of different questions here. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but there's lots of good practice on this that can be found with a little bit of searching online. Okay, so I put my formula for all seasons on the top up here so that I can remember it. And now we've got, in a closed economy with only lump sum taxation, if the MPC is equal to 0.75, a $70 billion increase in government spending could cause a maximum increase in output of. So again, we're just going to read that as max increase in aggregate demand as a result of an increase in government spending. So the first thing you can do is you can find your spending multiplier. So 1 over MPS, which would be 1 over 0.25, which would be 4 in this case. So if we're looking for, the max change in aggregate demand is equal to initial change in aggregate demand times the spending multiplier. So in this case, we've got a $70 billion increase times 4 would equal a $280 billion increase. And it's important to note your directional change, right? Because if it's a decrease in spending, aggregate demand is going to go down. If it's a decrease in taxes, aggregate demand is going to go up. So sometimes I ask my students to put a little minus sign in front of their tax multiplier, not because it's negative, but because there's an inverse relationship between taxes and aggregate demand. One goes up, the other goes down, and so on. All right, so now let's look at the next one. Assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. If the government increases its purchases of goods and services by 200 billion and exports decline by 200 and exports decline by 50, at most equilibrium income will, well, income. Remember that income is analogous to real GDP, depending on how you're calculating it. So we're still just looking for the same thing. All right, so let's find our spending multiplier. So it's 1 over MPS, which in this case is equal to 1 over 0.2, which would be 5. So what we're going to see is that if G goes up by 200 times 5, then we're going to have an increase of $1,000 in income as a result of the increase in government spending. However, exports are declining. So if exports are going down by 50 times 5, then we have a $250 decrease. So if the increase in G causes a $1,000 increase and the decrease in exports causes a $250 decrease, then we end up with a $750 increase in aggregate, in the equilibrium level of income. Okay, so you can deal with more than one thing going on just by splitting them up and seeing the net effect. Okay, so now let's go up here. Go down here. Assume the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. As a result of an increase in the tax rates, the government collects an additional 20 million. What will be the impact on gross domestic product? So now we're looking to use the tax multiplier. So if the MPC is equal to 0.9, then the tax multiplier is going to be equal to 0.9 over 0.1, right? MPC over MPS, which equals 9. And so if the government increases taxes by 20 million, what is the max change on real GDP? Well, we're going to multiply that by the multiplier, and we're going to get a $180 million change. Now, if taxes go up, then real GDP is going down. So make sure you note your directional change here. So it would produce a $100 million decrease, $180 million decrease. So now this last one is what we can call a balanced budget multiplier question. This is a conceptual question as much as it is an arithmetic question. So assume the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. How will a decrease in taxes of 100 billion and a decrease in government spending of 100 billion affect aggregate demand? Well, so if taxes go down, right? If taxes go down, then AD will go up. So if taxes go down by 100 billion, then aggregate demand is going to go up by 100 billion times the multiplier, which in this case would be 0.8 over 0.2, which would be 4. So this is going to cause a $400 billion increase in aggregate demand. However, in order to keep the budget balanced, we're changing taxes and spending at the same time. So if we cut taxes by 10 billion and we want to keep our budget balanced, we have to decrease spending by 100 billion because we're taking in 100 billion less, we're going to spend 100 billion less. There'll be no change on the budget balance. But because, remember, the spending multiplier is greater than the tax multiplier, the effect of the change in spending on aggregate demand is going to be bigger than the effect of the change in taxes on aggregate demand. So let's see where we're going to end up. So if spending is going to decrease, then aggregate demand is going to decrease. We have a $100 billion decrease, but now we're multiplying it times 1 over MPC, 1 over MPS, which would be 1 over 0.2, which would be 5. So we're going to have a $500 billion decrease in aggregate demand. So the net effect, right? It's going up by 400 billion, but it's going down by 500 billion. So the net effect is a $100 billion decrease in aggregate demand. And look, it is the exact same as the decrease in spending, right? So you get some contractionary effect or some expansionary effect when you change taxes and spending in such a way as to not affect the budget balance. Okay, so the balanced budget multiplier is actually 1. Okay, all right, so now I think we have time for maybe one FRQ. So I'm going to pull up some of the other questions and we'll just do this one because this is the nice conclusion for everything that we're doing here in Unit 3. So to finish up our Unit 3 review, we'll take a look at the 2019 long FRQ, parts A through C. So we're, as you know, you're not going to be graphing this year on the AP Macro exam, but you could certainly expect to be asked questions about some of these concepts, and having a graph handy would be a great idea in order for you to be able to do that. All right, so we're told that Canada is an open economy that is currently in a recessionary output gap. Okay, so we know our initial condition. We know that our current output is less than our potential output. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the ADAS model and show each of the following. So we can do that real quick. Okay, so you want to make sure that your axes and your curves and your equilibrium points are accurately labeled. So we have price level and real GDP. And I always recommend to my students that they find current output and price level before they show the condition of the economy. So we have Y1 and PL1. That's what we're asked for in the first part of the question. And then the second part asks for full employment. So we know that YC is less than YF. So that means YF has to be over here. And that's where we can put our long run aggregate supply curve. So there's an economy in a recessionary gap. The central bank and the government do not take any policy actions to close the output gap. Explain how the economy will adjust to full employment in the long run. So this is what you reviewed last night. So what you've learned is that the short run aggregate supply will increase. And that is because of falling input prices. And you talked about these last night, right? Like wages, commodity prices that result from a recessionary gap. Remember, when you're producing less than full employment levels of output, some of your resources are unemployed. And so the prices for them are going to fall. So then B2 says on your graph in part A, show how the economy adjusts to full employment in the long run. Well, we just wrote it, short run aggregate supply will increase. So now we want to show it. SRAS is going to shift to the right. Let's put a little 2 here. Okay, and so now that level of output is going to increase from Y1 to YF, and the price level is going to fall from PL1 to PL2. So that's the effect, that's the adjustment on the graph. Okay, and finally, suppose the Canadian government is unwilling to wait for the long run adjustment process. We're told that MPC is 0.8, real output, equilibrium real output is 500 billion, and the full employment output is 540 billion. So what they're saying here is that the current output is 500 billion, and the full employment level of output is 540 billion. So the amount of the output gap is $40 billion. So just keep a little note of that off to the side, right? The output gap is 40 billion. And we know that the MPC is 0.8. So if the MPC is, it says calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of the change in government spending required to shift the aggregate demand curve by the amount of the output gap. So if instead of waiting for SRAS to shift to the right, we wanted to try to use fiscal policy to stimulate aggregate demand, we'd want to get it to move from here to, and I shouldn't draw it on my graph, that's bad practice, but because that's not part of the question, but just so you see it, the idea would be to close the gap by increasing aggregate demand. So how much government spending do we need to get a $40 billion increase in real GDP? And we can use our formula. So if the max change in aggregate demand is equal to the initial change in aggregate demand times the spending multiplier. So in this case, we know that we want a $40 billion increase. And so the question is, how much do we have to spend in order to get it? Well, that's a function of the multiplier, which in this case would be, it's 1 over 0.2, which would be 5. So x times 5 equals 40, divide both sides by 5, and we get that the increase in government spending should be an $8 billion. The next part of the question says, calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of a change in taxes required to shift the aggregate demand curve by the amount of the output gap. Well, the output gap is still $40 billion, right? So we would still want to see a change of $40 billion increase at the end of the day. So how much do we have to change taxes by? Well, we would just have to divide both sides by the tax multiplier. And again, the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the spending multiplier. So if the tax multiplier is MPC over MPS, which in this case would be 0.8 over 0.2 equals 4, and remember we move in opposite directions, we would want to divide both sides by, in this case, 4, and we would see that we want a $10 billion tax cut. Tax cut. We'd want to decrease taxes by $10 billion in order to stimulate spending to close a $40 billion output gap. Okay. All right, so that was a really great question to bring together all the concepts in this unit. We've got our ADAS model, we've got an output gap, we have a long run self-correction, and we have fiscal, both change in taxes and change in spending, what would be necessary in order to close an output gap. So that really puts almost all of the concepts in this unit together. Okay, so that really brings us to the end. So we'll just pull things up to finish off for tonight. So again, we have to skip through the slides that we didn't do. Okay, so we spent, we spent most of our time on fiscal policy and the multipliers. We did also talk about automatic stabilizers, and hopefully at this point you feel really comfortable and confident using the ADAS model to describe, predict, and explain how changes in any of the expenditure categories in aggregate demand are going to influence the economy. But most importantly, especially given what's going on right now, how does fiscal policy have the potential to affect economic outcomes? All right, and I will leave you with one more reminder that tomorrow night is the masterclass with Janet Yellen, former chair of the Fed, not to be missed. And as always, we finish up with our call to let you know that if you or someone you know needs a device or has issues with the internet, please reach out to cb.org/tech. And the College Board is determined to help all students who wish to do so take their AP exams in May. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.